As far as I'm concerned, as long as that same respect and recognition is not shown toward every one of our people in this country, it doesn't exist for me. And during the few moments that we have left, we want to have just an off-the-cuff chat between you and me. Us. We want to talk right down to earth in a language that everybody here can easily understand.
For circumstances many of my listeners might be aware of, I haven't been able to record in some time. But as I'm trying to establish a routine again and get back into normality again of my life, I couldn't think of a better first back episode than with our guest today, Colin Bodayle, whose work I have come across on, actually, as I always do, find amazing people on Twitter. And I've really been fascinated about the way his ability to explain what Marxism means in Capital and Marx's methodology. And I thought, you know what, it's been a long time since I haven't done a theory heavy episode. So I think now is the time. Joining me also is a voice you're familiar with, a regular co-host, Christian Joseph. But first and foremost, welcome to the Malcolm Effect, Colin. How are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm good. I mean, all things considered, I'm in good spirits. And I thank you for so much for being flexible. I know we had some cancellations, but I'm really excited to have this conversation with you. So let's just go straight into it. What would you say is Marx's contribution to the Western philosophical tradition / canon?
Yeah, I think this is an interesting question. And one of the difficulties in answering it is that Marx has really three sources of influence. One is the French utopian socialist tradition. The other is classical German philosophy. And then the final source is the English political economy tradition. And so when reading Marx, it's hard to... Some of it, we think of philosophy in kind of more and more rigid categories, I think, especially into the 20th century. But Marx is doing work that is cross-disciplinary, right? And so, but to think about his contributions to Western philosophy, it might help to think about like what tradition he comes from. So he comes from the young Hegelians, who he eventually split with, who were the left-wing students of Hegel. There's a lot of debate about where Hegel's politics ended up, but the young Hegel, at least for sure, was very much rooted in the liberal ideas of the French Revolution. He even adopted a kind of revolutionary defeatist position, hoping that, you know, his fellow German speakers would be defeated by the French to bring ideas of liberty, fraternity, equality. Mm-hmm. And his students were definitely the more left-wing side of the Revolution of 1848 in Germany, the kind of more socialistic leaning side. And so I think what Marx really does for the Western philosophical tradition is to take this dialectical way of thinking developed by Hegel and to put it on a materialist foundation, and to also recognize the way in which philosophy is not just a great conversation of ideas, but that these ideas are situated within the real material existence of human beings who have to actually reproduce the conditions of their own existence in order to philosophize at all, right? Like, to philosophize, you have to eat, you have to have the time to philosophize, and all of these things which are absent in Hegel's attempt to think about the whole history of philosophy. I think what's also important about Marx is that he really develops this, you know, ideas of communism and socialism existed before Marx, but he really develops this materialist method of analyzing history itself in a matter that we might call even scientific. In fact, we could answer this question by looking at Friedrich Engels' eulogy, where Friedrich Engels said that that most great thinkers are content with knowing that they discovered one great discovery in their life. Marx discovered two. He discovered the laws of history and the laws of capitalism. So I think that those two would probably be his greatest contributions to the history of Western thought.
No, thank you so much for that answer. And I thank you for also bringing up Hegel, because, you know, many Marxist circles, they'll quote the famous line, you know, Marx flipped Hegel on his head. So I guess my question is, like, how do you understand this, and how much is Marx a Hegelian?
It's a very important question. And I think that this question is always appearing in the context of different political struggles and different ways of reading Marx that are connected to different political projects. But one thing that's like, I think, interesting when thinking about the history of philosophy from a historical materialist perspective is to think of not just what the thinkers thought, but how the thinkers were received and how our reading has been shaped by the material conditions of different schools of reading and rereading. And so something about Hegel in the history of philosophy in the 20th century is that Hegel has often been used as a kind of proxy figure or stand-in for Marx. When people attack Hegel, they're often attacking Marx by proxy. And there's also some attempt to fuse Hegel more with the early Marx than with the late Marx. So to answer the question more directly, it seems that the kind of conventional wisdom is that the early Marx is more Hegelian and the later Marx breaks with Hegel. And this is the claim that Althusser makes, as well as other people. But it seems to me that the early Marx is actually far more critical of Hegel. Yet before Marx wrote Capital, he spent a lot of time studying the science of logic, which is a work by Hegel that's often not as well studied as the phenomenology of spirit. And from the science of logic, what Marx took is the dialectical method of thinking, this, which we can go into in more detail, but this way of building things in layers, moving from the more abstract components to the more concrete components, and also thinking in terms of, not in terms of static, rigid categories, but in terms of moving categories. So what he says is the mystification that the dialectic suffers in Hegel's hands by no means prevents him from being the first to present its general forms of motion in a comprehensive and conscious manner. So dialectic is thinking in movement. It's thinking that takes seemingly stable categories and show how they contradict themselves and turn into their opposites. It goes back to the arguments of the sophists, the skeptics, of Zeno in ancient Greece. But he says that Hegel identifies these general forms of motion. But with Hegel, the dialectic, is standing on its head. It must be inverted in order to discover the rational kernel within the mystical shell. So there's two operations here. There's the inversion of Hegel, turning Hegel upside down, and there's the finding the rational kernel within the rational shell. And what's interesting here is that this theme of inversion, this language of inversion, actually comes from Feuerbach. And by this, Feuerbach was talking about turning the idealism upside down into a materialism. But something that I don't think many people have noticed, at least I noticed it, but I haven't seen anyone else point it out. I'm sure that somebody has seen it before, is that this language of the rational kernel in the mystical shell actually comes from the young Hegelian Bruno Bauer. And what Bruno Bauer claimed is that Hegel was a closet atheist, and that the truth of Hegelian philosophy is self-consciousness, the kind of movement of the I-thinking itself, this dialectical movement found in the method, is the rational kernel. And he placed this in a theological shell. And so what Marx is literally saying here is that Hegel has to be inverted into a materialist dialectic in order before we can find the rational kernel of dialectic within the larger shell. Another way that Engels puts this is that the left Hegelians were the ones who thought that Hegel's dialectical method was the most revolutionary component of his philosophy, whereas the right Hegelians thought the system of, like, Hegel's entire logic from start to beginning, or the encyclopedia from start to beginning, was the more important component. And Engels says that this method, what it does is there's the famous statement, it's often said as the rational is the real is the rational. In fact, Hegel uses the word wirklich, which is actual. And by actual, he means that which has actually come into being according to its concept. So, for example, if you were to take the idea of freedom from liberalism, for Hegel, like, freedom would only be actualized if it's materialized in reality, if everyone's actually free. So a society like the United States that says, we're all about freedom, but as we know, the United States, not everyone is free in the United States, and when this was said, the United States still had slavery, Hegel would say, well, this concept has not actualized itself. And Engels' reading of this statement is to say that we actually need to apply this statement to itself and realize that everything unactual, everything that doesn't match up to itself, everything that has a germ of irrationality or contradiction within it deserves to perish, and will perish due to these internal contradictions.
No, thank you so much for that. That's a brilliant response. So you've mentioned and invoked, okay, we have to make Hegel's dialectic material. give it a materialist understanding, right? A materialist reading. And then again, oftentimes in like organizing circles, or when leftists get together, you might hear, you need to have a concrete assessment or concrete analysis of the concrete facts. What does that even mean, or how do you understand that?
Yeah, so let me first say something about materialism, and then I'll say something about the idea of the concrete means. So materialism has a long tradition in philosophy. You could go back to like Democritus, the Epicureans, or Lucretius. And that was what Marx wrote his dissertation on, was ancient Greek and Roman atomism. And in the materialist tradition, there's an idea that the truth of reality is matter and its various arrangements and configurations, and that ideas are ultimately a result of matter. And so Lucretius, in his book on nature, he says at the beginning that if we don't understand the material nature of reality, we will be led by superstition. And he gives this example of like a father who kills his daughter because he thought he had to for the gods. And he says that this is the kind of thing that can happen when people are moved by ideas and don't understand the material reality that produces these ideas. Yet Marxist materialism is very different from the materialism that we find in most of the traditional philosophical materialism, like the French materialism of the 18th century, or the materialism of someone like Hobbes in the Leviathan. And that's because of the introduction of dialectic and of movement. And one of the key aspects of the dialectical approach to materialism, as opposed to what we might call the metaphysical or mechanical approach to materialism, is that Marx's materialism is not reductionist. So it's not saying that everything is atoms, and it's not saying that all ideas and all thoughts are just fictions or an epiphenomenon, but that we cannot think unless we have brains, are well fed, have time to think, and then we do produce ideas and conceptions. And we do take these ideas and conceptions and act on the basis of them. But the structure of matter and the structure of reality itself, and since this is a non-reductive materialism, society too is a kind of higher level of material configuration. The structure of the society is going to inform the kinds of ideas that are produced, and who holds power is going to produce ideas that help them maintain power, right? And so what idealism is not so much the belief that everything just exists in our minds. That is a position sometimes called idealism. But it's the position that where knowing should start is with what's within consciousness or what's within thought. And then we should move from this analysis of thought within itself and then kind of take that and stamp it onto reality, or use that as a model for how we should make things in reality. So if you think about the classical liberal tradition, like John Locke or Rousseau, they are idealists because they don't start from what is the actual history of society and the class structure of these different societies, and where was the money, where was the power, where was the weapons, but what would be an ideal society? Let's put people on a desert island in our imagination and come up with this model, and then we're going to take that ideal model, and we're going to try to put it into reality. So I'd say that's what idealism versus materialism is in terms of their starting point. Are you starting in your head, or are you understanding the thoughts in your head to be a product of the history of and material relations within the society you live in? For then the point about moving from abstract to the concrete, when people say a concrete analysis, well, so the term abstract comes from Hegel, and that's the opposite of concrete. Hegel gives an example in this essay he wrote for a popular audience. One of Hegel's clearest essays. I think anybody can read it. I actually, kind of as a flex, because I can tell people, hey, I assigned Hegel as the first reading. I assign this to my students as the first reading. It's called Who Thinks Abstractly? But it's very, very quite easy to read because it's written for a journal, popular audience. And when he gives this example of a murderer being led to the gallows. And this murderer is pretty good looking, right? And so there's some like ladies standing by, and they're like, "Ooh, that's a nice looking dude," And everyone's standing around and saying, "How can you dare call this murderer good looking? Don't you know he's a murderer, right?" There's plenty of people out there who are attracted to bad boys or bad girls, right? And so, but Hegel says that these people who say oh, how can you say this? Don't you know this person is a murderer? That these people who condemn this, they're thinking abstractly, because for them the murderer is just a murderer, and they see anything that they have reduced the murderer to this abstraction of a murderer, to this essence of a murderer, and anything that contradicts or goes against their idea of what constitutes a murderer. I always ask my students about like, well, how does Walt Disney always like paint the good people versus the bad people, right? Like anything that goes against their abstraction of a murderer is dismissed. But Hegel says that's not the real murderer. The real murderer is the entire, and he doesn't use the word concrete in this essay, but I think it's implied, the entire concrete history of the murderer, his family, the conditions that produced him into being a murderer. And he says if a psychologist came and studied the history of this murderer, people go around and be like, oh, you're trying to excuse the murderer. You're trying to say that he's justified because he had this background, right? And Hegel's saying that's not what this person's doing at all. They're trying to understand concretely what conditions produce this murderer. And similarly, he gives the examples of an old lady who, some like kind of Karen on Karen moment where this young woman wants to return these rotten eggs, and she's like, "Old lady, you sold me some rotten eggs." She's like, "Oh, really? Rotten eggs? I mean, look at what you're wearing, and like I heard that your mother slept with a soldier, and like all this stuff." And Hegel's like, "None of this has anything to do with the eggs." But this person who brought up this complaint about the rotten eggs, for the old lady, she's been reduced entirely to the abstraction of the person who called her eggs rotten, and everything she brings in is just an argument to further like support this abstraction. And so thinking abstractly is when you take one aspect of a thing and you universalize it or essentialize it. You code everything in terms of the one abstraction and reduce it to this one thing. Whereas thinking concretely is, if you think about, it's not quite a contradiction to say that a person can be both beautiful and a murderer, but they seem at least opposed in thought. They seem to not go together. I mean, but maybe, I don't know, the fascination with serial killers on like crap telly, who knows, like, right? But and so thinking concretely is looking at something with all of its oppositions, all of its contradictions, the good, the bad, and making this full assessment of it.
Thank you so much for that answer. I think Christian had a follow-up.
Yeah. So I think one of the things, well, I had a couple follow-ups. I think one of the things I wanted to speak on was the point you made about metaphysical and mechanical ways of thinking. And, in the first section on contradiction, when Mao paraphrases Lenin on like the two world outlooks, he talks about, the metaphysical world outlook, and he talks about the dialectical world outlook. And so I guess like when it comes to those distinctions, is there any place for an understanding of a metaphysical in conjunction with Marxist thought? Or, because it is directly opposed from dialectical thinking, is it just to be discarded? And then I would also say, when we talk about motion, contradiction, and dialectics as thought of with regards to motion, what is a mechanical worldview, or what are mechanical processes, and is there any place for that as well?
Good questions. So on the role of metaphysics, let me say a couple of things. So first, when Mao, following Engels, uses the word metaphysics, he's using it in a different sense than what's typically used in philosophy. Although I personally think, and I'm trying to argue in my current work, that it's somewhat justified, it's somewhat similar, but it's generally different than what we mean by metaphysics, or say what Heidegger or Derrida means by metaphysics. Although I think that there's more of a family resemblance than people might think. Because when we think about metaphysics, often we think about metaphysics as a doctrine of the thing in itself, a doctrine of reality in itself, or we think about metaphysics in terms of so to put it into like historical terms, what was called metaphysics in scholasticism was divided into two fields: general metaphysics and special metaphysics. General metaphysics deals with ontology and also like questions of like modality, meaning like possible, impossible, necessity, things like that. And then there's special metaphysics, which dealt with God, the soul, and the world, universe, cosmos. But there's also this sense of metaphysics that comes from Heidegger, where metaphysics is any theory that's tries to give an ontological account of being or reality itself. But the way that Engels and Mao understand the term metaphysics, in my view, comes from Hegel. Now, it's a contentious position that I take by saying that this is also how Hegel uses the term metaphysics. There's a big debate about Hegel's relation to metaphysics. But the way I read Hegel is that he understands metaphysical thinking to not just mean thinking about God or whatever, or thinking about reality itself, but what he calls the metaphysics of the abstract understanding. The metaphysics, in this sense, thinks in terms of sharp oppositions mediated by the law of non-contradiction. So it says something is either this or it's that. It's either a cause or it's an effect. It's either, another example, you're either have free will or you're completely determined. And dialectics is an attempt to show that all of the attempts of metaphysics to think in terms of these binary, non-contradictory categories, where something is either entirely one thing or entirely another thing. Dialectics is an attempt to undo that. So the science of logic, which is Hegel's masterpiece, starts with the term being, pure being, what Heidegger talks about. And then it says, well, what is pure being? Well, being, in every sense, we can't even say that it is, because that would be a sense of being that's not contained within being. It pertains to everything. It has no content. And so really, if we look at what being, pure being is, we see that the content of this concept is nothing. Well, that's the opposite of being. Then we ask, what is nothing? We just said, what is nothing, right? When you try to think about what was in existence before there was anything, and you say there was nothing, well, then you've already imagined there being the existence of nothing at like maybe a time before creation or something like this. And so nothing has turned again into its opposite. And so that's Hegel's method in the logic, is to take all of the kind of oppositions and categories that we've built metaphysics out of, and to show how each of them has a breaking point where it turns into the opposite category. Now, is there a role for metaphysics? Now, this is something that, after reading, the Mao essay and Engels and things like that, I got maybe a little bit too carried away with contradiction. And so something that a critique that I'm now kind of self-criticizing with is to recognize that there is a role for what Hegel and Engels call metaphysical thinking. And the role is as a kind of starting point. So when we start to do an analysis, we need to divide things into sharp categories and sharp divisions, but we can't, and we need to abstract. An example I like to use is Einstein, right? So Einstein did not do any kind of it's not like he went to a lab to discover relativity. He read somewhere that someone discovered that the speed of light was constant in all circumstances. So he abstracted the speed of light from the air that slows it down, from glass, from all of these different things, and tried to understand, if we take this abstraction and work it out and think about it, what does reality look like? He took that abstraction and concretized it. And similarly, when we make a distinction between causes and effects, like we might need to start by making a rigorous distinction between those two before looking at how things become contradictory and become dialectical. Like we need to start by drawing our boundaries and defining different things before we move to the stage of looking at how these boundaries are not so rigid. And then I think the second question was about mechanism. And I think the mechanistic viewpoint, the issue with mechanism is that it usually ends up discounting the role of ideas and the role of consciousness in thinking about reality and changing it. Because from the dialectical materialist standpoint, as opposed to the mechanical materialist standpoint, the mechanical materialist standpoint would say that, there are laws of history. They're going to produce a certain result at some point, and it can lead to this kind of the Presbyterian version of Marxism, where you're like, well, let's just sit back, wait for capitalism to destroy itself and communism to usher itself in automatically. Whereas for Marx's position is that we can use our brains to think about things and to form ideas of them. And if we have an accurate conception of reality and then act on the basis of that and try to bring our ideas into reality, that is the movement from the ideal back to the real. So to kind of put it into a full picture, the dialectical approach is a movement from the matter to the ideal and then back from the ideal to the matter. And it claims that the matter is what determines things where the rubber meets the road, or in the last instance. But it doesn't claim that the ideal has no effect, but that it's a product of the material. So based on my circumstances in society, I'm able to perhaps study Marxism, right? Like, so like Lenin sat down, studied Marx's text, studied Hegel's logic, and I'm able to use that to develop the best theory I can of how things work. And that theory that I develop and produce during that time, that informs my ability to then act and then rechange the material world. And then how I rechange the material world, that's going to create, reconfigure the ideas that people have in their heads based on the reconfiguration of the material states. They might think of new things and then act to change the world too. And so it's a dialectical process where the way that the world is and the way that history and the material social relations are configured informs how we produce ideas. But then what makes those ideas go, well, for one thing, as Mao talks about in On Practice, what validates the idea is practice, whether I can actually carry out my conception. But when you carry out a conception, you then reconfigure the material world. So it's this back and forth moment. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. That was a dope answer.
Yeah, for sure, for
Christian,
sure.
go ahead.
Yeah, no, and I think it starts to get into, some deeper questions I had about Heidegger. But I think even before that, I think one thing that you mentioned that was interesting was the idea that, and please correct me if I'm wrong, I think you had mentioned something about, everything that has some sort of contradiction must eventually perish. Or is it that everything that has, some sort of small amount of rationality must perish? I think, well, first of all, I wanted to clarify that before I asked the follow-up, because that's kind of like an important basis, because I just had a thought as you were talking about idealism versus the material. But is it true that, basically every contradiction must eventually transform or result in a transformation? Would you say that's something that's true?
So I think it's probably right. I can't think of there. There are contradictions that persist for a while, but I think the way to think about things is to say that everything has principal point of tension within it, and
Mm-hmm.
one side is going to give way, and that's how you can see where things are headed. And so I think that it's correct to say, from the Marxist dialectical materialist standpoint, that to analyze the future of anything is to analyze the points of contradictions and to recognize those points of contradiction as the possible outcomes. So let me give an example from the world of physics. The Earth is rotating around the sun, and Marx actually says in Capital that this is an example of a real contradiction. The Earth is both falling from the sun and, because of its inertia, moving away from the sun. And he says that that contradiction between those two opposing motions, that the contradiction doesn't just go away, but that is actually the source of the ellipses, which is the resolution of that contradiction into a form of motion. So that it's actually what's driving things is that contradiction itself, those two opposing ends. But looking at that contradiction also shows us where things are headed. I mean, I think anybody can sit down and reason, well, what's going to happen to the Earth at some point? Well, it's either going to be sucked into the sun, or it's going to fly off and leave orbit, freeze, and then land up in a black hole somewhere. The other third option would be that the sun itself explodes and destroys the Earth with it. But that point of tension in the Earth's orbit already tells us where things could be headed. Similarly, to take a political example, the climate catastrophe, right? Like, we are either going to stop this or our planet's going to be destroyed. We're either going to reconfigure our modes of energy production to a way that's not creating a climate catastrophe, or life is going to become largely uninhabitable, and that's going to lead to at least a major shift in the kind of political and social structures of our societies, if humanity even exists at all after that catastrophe. I think you had a second. Did you have a second question about contradiction?
Yeah, no, and well, part of the reason I wanted to establish, like, if a contradiction must reach a resolution, is what then do we make of, long-standing contradictions, such as the contradiction between, say, the idealism and the material, or even long-standing contradictions between economic base and superstructure. What
Mm.
kind of resolutions do those reach, or are these just contradictions that are almost like fundamental laws of nature that just carry on for
That's a
God
good
knows
question.
for God knows how long.
Yeah, I think that a way to think about a contradiction is kind of as a source of movement in itself. And so if you look at Hegel's theory of time, which Engels endorses in the Dialectics of Nature, Hegel looks at how Zeno says that time is impossible, because Zeno is a student of Parmenides, so he doesn't think time is impossible. because of these inherent contradictions. And I'm actually teaching Zeno tomorrow, so maybe if I prepared for class earlier this morning, I could say more about Zeno. The Hegelian position is that the now, the moment, the present moment, is inherently self-abolishing and self-contradictory, because like, when is the now? It's now. Oops, it's gone, right? It's a state that both kind of is and is not at the same time. And so the driving force of movement at the very most basic level of history, which is time, from the dialectical standpoint, is this inherent contradiction of the present moment contradicting itself, because it can't. If it is, it isn't. So at a larger scale, a kind of form like the base superstructure, or the mode of production and relations of production. The way that the mode of production and relations of production relate to each other is through one of the what Engels calls one of the laws of dialectics, the laws of the transformation of quantity into quality, and vice versa. And John Bellamy Foster gave a talk at the Critical Theory workshop yesterday that was on this topic, where he talked about how, he kind of sees this as one of the more central aspects of Marxist theory, whereas I think I would read this more as an example of how something turns into its opposite, because quantity and quality are opposites. And so I think if you look at the mode of production and the relation of production stand in contradiction with each other, and when the relations of production become a fetter on the mode of production, on the development of the mode of production, this breaks and causes a rearrangement of the relations of production, either through configuring things in a kind of reformist mode to keep some semblance of the current relations of production, or through a revolution that actually transforms society completely. And so maybe it's better to think of the mode and relations of production, which are kind of like larger meta-ideal categories, as, because I think that these would be what Engels would identify as the laws discovered by Marx. These perhaps are not, this law, it seems, would not itself go away unless human society were itself to disappear, right? Maybe the environmental catastrophe destroying us would be the end of the mode of production, relations of production, contradiction. But that they are a kind of metastructure, or what Marx calls in that passage a form of motion, that helps us explain how contradictions unfold in society. And I think here it's important to contrast Marx with, or compare Marx to Darwin, because like the law of evolution by natural selection of survival of the fittest is a very general, abstract category that covers a wide range of history, but allows is a kind of like basis that you can use for the more concrete investigation of how did actual species evolve. And Marx was very influenced by Darwin, and I think that his attempt to understand history is similar to Darwin's attempt to find laws of the origins of species. Marx is trying to find laws of the history and transformations of societies into other societies, if that makes sense. So hopefully that helped answer some of that
Yeah,
question.
no, I think that was very helpful. And one thing that I thought was interesting was the when, especially given that we already brought up on contradiction, is that there's a point in on contradiction when you talk about an ecological crisis being the resolution of the contradiction between means of and relations of production. There's a point in there where Mao talks about the development of countries not largely being due to the social structures of given societies, and not being affected by the climate or the geography. But it's very it's almost like how people say Marx failed to consider. It's like Mao failed to consider. But
Right. I wonder if he's reacting against the types of people who say that everything is just geography.
Right. That's his point. That's his point, which is right on. But I think
not to like mention Dugan because he's a weirdo, but like that's one of his early theories is he's like the geography guy. He's like everything's about sea or land, right? And so there is like this German tradition that now is probably kind of rejecting it with that. But that's an interesting point. Yeah.
Right. No, absolutely. But I wanted to talk a little bit more about Heidegger before we got too far away from it, because I think your piece that you've written on Heidegger recently is very interesting. And also you categorize Heideggerian thought as, a subjective idealism. But I think what's also interesting and relevant is Heidegger is not so much that, is just categorizing Heidegger as a subjective idealism, but also given Heidegger's role within intellectual production today and his popularity amongst so many other, scholars. So, what is the reason everybody, and these are people on the quote unquote left. What is with people's on the left's preoccupation with ontology, their preoccupation with Heidegger, and what is the proper response to it? And I think you kind of touched on this a little bit before, if everyone's so fixated on ontology from a Heideggerian perspective, or even, then what is a Marxian response, or what is a
Mm.
Marxian way to have an understanding of ontology without slipping into an idealism?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think that it would be interesting to do a very detailed study of the reception of Heidegger. My teacher, Gabriel Rockhill, has done a lot of work on the reception of French theory, but it would be interesting to look at the material history and behind the scenes work of Heidegger's rehabilitation after, he was a Nazi and then all of a sudden suddenly became like the most important thinker of the West. And there's something I've noticed about, and I don't know, are either of y'all in philosophy departments?
No, but I'm in Africana, so somewhat adjacent.
Yeah, no, I just organize right now.
Mm-hmm. There's like something that in some philosophy departments where you kind of get like thrown in the middle of debates and they feel vaguely political to you and you're not exactly sure what the political stakes are. Like I remember like when I first like jumped into one of the grad programs I went to, like there was like a lot of people talking about otherness and alterity, and I was like, why would we just like all this, when did we all decide that alterity and otherness is good, sameness is bad, and like categorically, even if it doesn't have anything to, and I'm not even sure what it has to do with politics at this point, because we're just talking about like, oh well, Kant says these two things are the same, so he's like rejecting alterity. I'm like, this is I don't even know, like this is just in his like system or something, right? And so you get kind of pulled into certain conceptual ways of framing things within the academy and kind of almost like language games to participate in without asking questions. One of my comrades says that Marxists in philosophy departments are kind of like Socrates. We're just going, yeah, but is any of this true? Right? So like, and so and so with Heidegger, I think there's some assumptions that have kind of become in vogue in what we might call radical theory from Heidegger that I think might be questionable. And one of these is that the subject-object distinction, and blame everything on Descartes here, of course, even though I don't think Descartes ever uses this distinction, is somehow just inherently a problem. And Heidegger is supposed to be the one who resolves this with his concept of Dasein, because Dasein is just like the thrown existence of a human being into the world. But what's dangerous about just completely, there's a difference between criticizing the one-sidedness and metaphysical way of thinking about the distinction between subject and object. There's a difference between criticizing that and then just pretending that there is no subject-object distinction. And so when we look at what ontology is from a Heideggerian standpoint, it frequently seems to me, and there might be nuance here, but it frequently seems to me that there's a reduction of being to the meaning of being, or to how being is interpreted, how being holds sway at certain epochs of history, and that what would be called objectivity, or how being really is independently of how it's interpreted, is taken itself to be a second order interpretation of being. And so for Heidegger, we're first immersed in the world, inside a horizon of being, and then through scientific practice, we objectify things. But this in itself is a way of interpreting or a way of seeing things. Now, I think the subject-object distinction is worth defending as Marxist, as long as we don't become too rigid about it. And let me give an example here that goes back to Descartes. So Descartes says in the Meditations on First Philosophy, which I actually just taught last week, he talks about the two different ideas that he has of the sun. One idea of the sun is that the sun is very small, that he can cover it with his hand, and that the earth stands still, and the sun goes around it. And the other idea of the sun is the sun that he knows through, and here I'll quote it, astronomical reasoning. And this sun is an extended substance. And remember, Heidegger's whole critique in Being of Time of Descartes, he barely mentions the subject, he barely mentions the cogito. It's about the res extensia, the extended substance. What the real sun is a material thing made of matter, which Descartes understood in terms of extension. And that material thing produces effects on my senses. And the idea that I have of the sun is an idea that is a causal effect of the sun itself. The material configuration of the world actually produces false images in me. But when I use reason and understand how things are by beginning with what Descartes calls universal and simple notions, and work from the idea of the sun's a body, a material thing in space, it produces causal effects that I can understand through astronomy, through physics. Not only do you understand how the sun is configured, but you understand how your subjectivity is configured by that objectivity. And so in Descartes, in the mind-body problem, which Descartes admittedly does not solve and has a dualistic way of thinking about it, you can already see the germ of a materialist standpoint. And Descartes was regarded as a materialist when he first went. The meditations on first philosophy, like we read this in a lot of philosophy books, and we're like, oh, is this Descartes going to say that his soul is eternal and that God exists? Like, this is just this totally Christian work. It was banned by the Catholic Church because it was considered to be too materialistic. It was, and most of the people reading it were taking materialist ideas from Descartes, and Cartesian philosophy was known to be a kind of materialist philosophy. And so I think the subject-object distinction is important because it helps us distinguish between ideas produced in us, ideas in our heads, how we conceive of the world, what our theories of the world are, and how is the world really? What's the actual material configuration of the world? What's the world that we can understand scientifically? And when these are just ignored and everything is just, well, okay, so being is now understood in the postmodern or whatever metaphysics of Nietzsche to just be the will to power. And it used to be that the creek or the river or whatever appeared as like the Phus or Phusis to the pre-Socratics as this one unified experience of being, but now it's just this standing reserve to be manipulated and controlled, which is how Heidegger kind of sees it. This is all how we conceive of the world subjectively. But how is the world objectively? And what is it objectively that brings about this, kind of instrumental or technological way of seeing the world that Heidegger criticizes in Meaning and Time? Well, it's not turning everything into utility. It's the accumulation of surplus value. It's actually the material configuration of our society around producing profit for certain people. I mean, that's something. And so to go back to the question, I think one of the problems with Heidegger's ontology is that it collapses subjectivity and objectivity into each other. And it really all just becomes about the interpretation of being and the meaning of being. And I think you see this, and I mentioned certain decolonial thinkers at the end of the article, and I would definitely want to go back and double check to make sure I've been fair to these criticisms. But you sometimes get an impression in certain decolonial phenomenological approaches that what's at stake is not decolonizing Palestine, Hawaii, indigenous stolen land, Puerto Rico. What is instead at stake is decolonizing the syllabus or decolonizing certain ideas, and that colonialism is no longer a real material force, but that it's an epistemology or a structure of being, which isn't to say that there are not, that it's not, there's not an ideology that goes with colonialism, but it's to say that one needs to distinguish between the material effects of something and the ideas or subjective notions that are produced in accordance with the ruling class or the ones we produce to fight against the oppressors, right?
Thank you. No, that was a fantastic answer. That was a fantastic answer. And I think finally, my final question for today is specifically let's talk about capital, right? Given all that we've discussed, what do you feel is the significance of capital as a work? And what Marx puts across in Capital? What is he trying to do and tell us about the world?
Yeah, so Capital is a really fascinating work, and I think it's worth reading for everyone and worth reading multiple times and very closely and carefully. What Marx is trying to do in Capital is he's trying to explain the source of profit for the capitalist class, and he's doing this through a kind of immanent dialectical critique of classical political economy. And so he's actually, it's interesting because you hear people like Adam Smith are supposedly like people, kind of the libertarian anarcho-capitalist types will frequently refer to Adam Smith as the kind of fathers of their school of thinking. But if you actually go back and read Adam Smith, he's a lot closer to Karl Marx than he is to, say, Milton Friedman or Ayn Rand or any of these kinds of people. Because even Adam Smith recognizes that the source of value is labor. And there's even moments where he talks about how the workers and capitalists form different interest groups against each other, which is quite interesting. And so what Capital provides us with as a way of understanding how profits are made specifically through the extraction of surplus value from wage workers, from the proletariat. And the categories in it are helpful for figuring out exactly how much someone is being exploited for, how much profit you're producing for someone, and navigating the different types of mystifications that hide this exploitation. Let me see if I can remember the exact example. So there's an example of, if you think about a landlord, for instance, due to their kind of class configuration and the way that they see things, whenever they have to pay their mortgage on their house, they think of this as, oh, well, I have this expense. But really, they're just buying a house. And so if they are extracting rent from someone to pay their mortgage, from the bourgeois perspective, they're like, this is I have to take this rent from this person so I can buy this house for myself. But in fact, what's going on is this person is, with their rent, buying them a house, right? They're accumulating value. And so that's one aspect of Marx's analysis, is that it can help us like destroy the kind of false picture that people put on things, because one argument tends to be to try to say that the capitalist is really only profiting a little bit because all this money has to go and buy like the machinery and pay their rent and all this stuff. But then we just kind of miss the fact, well, but they're getting all this machinery and all this stuff too. You're just kind of helping them out at that point, right? That's actually, that might not be their going to their bank account, but it is something that's going to them. And I think capital is very, very good if you want to look at do an analysis of where profit comes from. One exercise I do with my students, in fact, is I put them into groups and I have them each research a commodity, and I have them trace the whole chain of labor in it. And I remember one year I had a bunch of students looking at Nike and Adidas, and then I had another group of students who were looking at like Chanel and I think Gucci. And what they found is that the Gucci and Chanel items weren't so expensive because of the brand identity. They were expensive because they had leather that was grown by like rich farmers in Italy. They paid like these expensive expensive handcrafts people to like make the leather and all of this stuff. Whereas Nike, as we know, is making all of this stuff with sweatshops. And I had a student go, oh, so actually these things are more expensive because the labor that goes into these things is more expensive. And one of the things that Marx argues is that what the primary thing that determines price is actually the amount of labor that's put into it. What he calls the socially necessary labor time is what determines the value of commodities. And what Marx gives us is this theory of surplus value. The idea that, I think I'm not going to go into the like kind of Cartesian step-by-step points of the theory, but I think we kind of all intuitively know this, and that's that if we can make a person work longer while paying them less, we produce way more profit, or the capitalists produce way more profit doing that. And we can see this, I think, in all kinds of areas. So one area I'm looking at particularly where Marx's analysis of surplus value has been helpful for me, as well as some of the later stuff about the Reserve Army of Labor, is I was looking, I think I did this in a couple Twitter posts, and I'm thinking of maybe making an article about it, how the cost, the wages of undocumented immigrants are much lower than the wages of documented immigrants. But in fact, the harsher the policies in the US are to undocumented immigrants, the lower the wages go. And so this is, I think, is a very interesting example of a dialectical contradiction, because Trump and all these people are very anti-immigrant. They like to criminalize these people with these stories, like this horrible story told about the Haitians. The reason that they do this is because it drives down the cost of the labor itself and increases the profits. It's not that they don't want the people here, they want to be able to exploit them even harsher. Kind of like the reason we that drugs are criminalized isn't to keep people from doing drugs, but to arrest people who do drugs, or have them planted on them, or whatever, to fuel the prison industry. I think we do need to update Marx's analysis in Capital when talking about the present day. We need to have an analysis of imperialism, and this is the kind of brilliance of Lenin, because Lenin recognized that there's a dialectical shift that takes place in the stage of imperialism, because Marx understood capitalism to be, well, he looked at the capitalism of his time and he said, we have a bunch of small capitalists who are competing against each other. So there can be price wars and things like this. And they try to outperform each other and outcompete. But Marx said this has a tendency to move towards monopolization. At Lenin's point of time, because one important part of Marx's analysis too is that he says Marx has an analysis of settler colonialism, and he talks about how there's a way of controlling the populations by sending people to the United States, for example. But what Lenin realizes is that capitalism has moved to its monopoly stage, where it's no longer competitions between these monopolies, but the monopolies are working in collusion with each other, and they're working in collusion with state power. And there's been this attempt of monopoly capitalism as imperialism to start dominating all of the resources of the globe now that the world is completely colonized. And so I think that we need to update Marx's analysis to take into account the monopolization of capital, as well as the role of imperialism and colonialism and neocolonialism today, if that makes sense.